Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to day one of Connections Online 2022. My name is Maurice Fitzgerald, and I will be the moderator of today's panel. I'm also better known as Mo, as you can see in my nickname down below. I'll be moderating today's panel where we will be discussing innovations in hobby wargaming. We have several fantastic designers with us today that will be talking about their designs as well as innovations in their games and other games that they've seen. First up, we have Bruce Maxwell. He is the designer of NATO The Cold War Goes Hot, as well as the upcoming Air and Armor. Both are by Compass Games. Then we have Fabrizio and Tony. They are from Thin Red Line Games, and they have the 1985 series and the C3 series, which they will be talking about. And finally, we have Mitch Land. He is the designer of the Next War series from GMT Games, and he's got 5 games now in that series, so it's a great series. If you haven't checked it out, definitely do so. That will be what we're going to do is we're going to have a discussion. Each one of them is going to do a presentation. And then after the presentations, we'll have the questions and answer after that. So we're going to start off first with Mitch, and we'll get him started. We'll take everyone else out, and we'll let Mitch do his presentation. So, Mitch, you ready to go?
Yep, let's go.
All righty.
All right, good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you happen to be tuning in from. Mitch Land, as Mo said, I worked on the Next War series for GMT as well as Silver Bayonet, and going to talk not necessarily about innovations in those series, although we'll touch on them a little bit, but just general innovations I've seen in hobby wargaming over the years and some newer or more recent games, I should say. Although I do find it slightly ironic that 3 of the heaviest hex and counter war games are designers or represented in this panel, so that's going to be very interesting. Anyway, so we're going to go behind the curtain. And I figure out how to advance the slide. There we go. So I just wanted to put this out here is what is wargaming. So I'm not going to read it to you. You can figure that out. But I think after we're done talking and during the Q&A, we might want to revisit this statement of what is wargaming and why is that important in terms of what I think I'm going to talk about. So we're just going to talk about some innovations I've seen just in printing, which seems very not very dramatic, but it's kind of important in the hobby wargaming space. Let's talk a little bit about mechanics, technology, and then some abstractions that I've seen coming in. So in terms of printing, so this is a screenshot from the Next War Vietnam game, and it might be a little bit hard to see, but really what I wanted to point out is that over the years, printing has gotten much better. I mean, even from mounted maps or paper maps, but you can see along the top, there are lines and movement connections and things like that. 10, maybe 20 years ago, that probably wasn't possible, even maybe 10 years ago. So printing has made great strides in the ability to present information on a particular map. Now, obviously, this is a very detailed hex and counter map as opposed to an area map or some point-to-point map or something like that. But still, it's important. One of the things I wanted to point out is take a look at this counter sheet that we've laid out. There's a lot of different colors that are butted up against each other, and some of them do have bleeds, but there are some like this orange and blue in the middle there that are bright butt up against each other. 10 years ago, you couldn't do that because the colors would bleed over. So it's actually opened up a lot of opportunity for larger counters and just different, better layouts of counters on a counter sheet. So you can get more into a game. And that's, like I said, it's not a super dramatic innovation in hobby wargaming, but from a developer or designer or producer, it's very important in terms of the production value. But even from a consumer, it's good because you get more out of that game. And if anybody wants to ask me about any of these counters, you can later. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, one of the things that I've seen, it's been a few years, but two different instances. So here you're seeing 2 different implementations of cyber warfare. And cyber warfare obviously is something that we all need to be aware of in any kind of modern gaming format. The one on the left, will be coming out in the upcoming Next War Supplement 3 for cyber war. And I chose to go down a path of very mechanically, not intense, but there's some die rolling involved and some choices to be made, and you place markers and you make some die rolls against those, and there's attack and defense values and things like that, and you end up with these hack markers on the different various nodes on there. On the right, you see, and this might be familiar to some of you, you see the cards and tokens from the Assassin's Mace game from those, or that, I guess it's a series of implementations. But anyway, they chose to go a card route, which, from an innovation standpoint, well, as I mentioned earlier, we're a bunch of crunchy gamers. So, that's why and that's why I chose the model on the left. You can get a lot of value out of a card-based system where most of that information is just right on the card. You pull it randomly from a deck and you slap it down. That takes care of the randomization of a die roll, the way that it gets played and the way that it gets marked on the map. Those kinds of innovations make games sometimes quicker and much more easily accessible. One of the pieces of feedback I know I've gotten a lot is it's the Next War series games are good, but they just take a long time to play. And that's true, right? But a lot of it's because there's all this decision-making space, specifically in the kinds of mechanics on the left-hand side, where you have to roll a die and you have to go to it, some kind of combat resolution or cyber team, penetration, defense resolution, whatever you want to call it, and then figure that out. And that takes a chunk of time, as opposed to I pull the card and I play it, right? So I just took what was a 5-minute process down to a 10-second process, or maybe 5-second process. So those kinds of innovations just speed up gameplay, and especially in a professional space, that can be a huge game changer, because you don't often all have a lot of time to play big, large, complex games. So I wanted to point out, so one of the things that I've seen recently in using last 100 yards, most of my games are going to be from GMT. It makes sense. But basically, it's the challenge of tried and true mechanisms. So, last 100 yards is one of the latest entries into the vast spectrum of tactical wargaming that kind of turns that whole thing on its head. Most games, if you just made the list of here's the tactical squad level games, they pretty much all do the same thing. You have squads, you have rules around how they move. It's either I go, you go, or some kind of interactive sequence. And what Mike Denson did with last 100 yards, and specifically, was turn that all on its head. There's only one active player. The other guy is just reacting. And it's all about squad leadership, as opposed to, I've got the best weapon system and here's how those systems interact. And so it's a very unique system that's a little bit more abstract from that standpoint, but works very well. Those kinds of innovations, I think, are very interesting in terms of putting a new spin on how games work, especially in this one, especially in the tactical space, which is important to think about. One of the other innovations I've seen lately, and these are a little bit older games, but they're kind of the first, at least the first ones that I experienced that use it, but they're app driven or app assisted. And so you'll have to, when you play the game, you got to pull out where's my camera? You got to pull out your phone, right? And download the app, and it either drives the game or helps you play the game, or in some way, shape, or manner, it's part of the game experience. So you have the board game in front of you and you have the app helping to drive the game. One of the downsides is if you don't support that app, the game will quickly become unplayable. 10 years from now, is anybody really going to be supporting the first Martians? I don't know. And that's one of the challenges that as publishers we have to figure out, is because we are paper and cardboard game developers and publishers first, not app developers. And so the app development and app maintenance is a totally different ball game, and you have to be able to commit to that and keep it up to date, because as soon as iOS or Android or whatever changes an operating system, sometimes your app doesn't work. Well, now you got to go update it. It's very cool. I think it's got a lot of potential. Again, streamlining the game. It takes a lot of let me go figure out how all this works out and put it in the app so that I can just push something to you and it controls the game. So it speeds the game up. The other thing I've seen, again, these are two games from GMT, Nevsky and Atlantic Chase, is a level of abstraction that we're seeing coming out of games. And the one on the left, the Levian Campaign series, Nevsky from Boko, has exploded. I mean, I can't even remember how many titles are in the works on that one, but it's much more of an abstract game, focuses on logistics, strangely enough, and granted in medieval-ish times, but still it's a much more abstract, no hexes, there are counters, but you don't really move them around on the map. You move little boxes around or blocks around. And then Atlantic Chase, while there are hexes, you don't really put stuff on the map. You have these, lines. I forget what they're called now, but that you're trying to track down, and there's a whole host of rules around how that works. And the level of abstraction that makes the game more approachable, I think, is what we're seeing more and more of coming out of game developers, not just GMT. Other game companies are doing it too, right? But it's getting the ability to get players into the game, into games, I should say, into war games, and giving them concepts and conceptual ideas and things that they can use to approach that. And then maybe, someday down the road, they actually play a next war style game or C3 or Air and Armor, which I'm looking forward to. But they're good ways to get people into the hobby, and that's something that we, as a hobby wargamer, we're always looking to do, is how do we get new gamers into the hobby and approaching. Because when you put something like Next War down and you say, well, move your brigade from this hex to this hex, the first question you get is, what's a brigade? Well, it's that little X with this. Yeah, I don't know what that means, right? People don't understand what NATO symbology is. And so things like this help with that, to give them that base level of knowledge once they get to that point. So that's why I put this at the beginning and at the end, is, challenging what does really a war game look like? And does it have to have hexes and counters and a CRT and things like that? And from the hobby wargaming standpoint, I think that definition is certainly migrating, or has migrated maybe, but it's more about this. Are you making decisions to affect the outcome of a game, right? Specifically around conflict. So one of the things to think about and talk about, I think. And so I think I'll stop there and let Mo have it back.
Thanks very much, Mitch. I really appreciate that. That was great. And you got a lot of ideas there for questions at the end, which we're going to remind everybody that questions and answers will be at the end. So if you have any questions about Mitch's games or any of the concepts he's talked about here, save them to the end if you could, please. So we're going to take Mitch out, and we're going to bring in Fabrizio and Tony. And whoops, I got the wrong one. There we go. And we're going to have Fab and Tony talk about the 1985 and the C3 series. If you're not familiar with them, you can go to trlgames.com and check them out, and I'll let them take it away. Okay.
So I'm Fabrizio Vianello from Thin Red Line Games. We are quite a new publisher for war games. We started something like 5 years ago. And we have basically two main series of game. One is 1985. That is a more strategic series. And the second series is a C3 series. That is more at an operational level. And it's probably the series that has the more innovative rules between the two. And so for the C3 series as an operational level at battalion, regiment units, with one turn that is only 3 hours and 5 kilometers per hex. The series will be on 5 modules, and at the moment we have already developed and published 2 of these modules. The first one is less than 60 miles, that covers the US 5th Corps area of responsibility during a hypothetical World War III in Central Europe in 1985. And the second module is the Docks of War, that covers the British Army of the Rhine area of responsibility, again in 1985 during World War III. And now it's up to Tony to present himself.
Well, hi, good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening, depending upon where you are in the world. I am probably slightly the odd one out here. I have not been doing this professionally very long at all. I was a serving officer in the British Army for nigh on 40 years. across a whole panel of things. But I have wargamed, and I have written rules, and I have run professional war games or developments within the services over the whole of that time period. I came into Thin Red Lines to help out on the 1985 series, and although we're not going to discuss that greatly here, I'll just give you a nod back. In Connections 21 last year, we talked a great deal about 1985. You can see it there. But where we did the innovation in that, and how Fabrizio has been innovating and changing the basis of, I think, hex and counter war games, is that 1985 started out as a rewrite of a 1977 classic, which was bizarrely also called The Next War. But that Next War, a massive game, was designed to represent a Warsaw Pact attack on NATO in the 1970s. Fabrizio rewrote it, and we ended up with a standard hex and counter tank and air slugfest in Western Germany. So what have we done since then? Well, this last year has seen us publish the final one in the trilogy, which takes us all the way out to a hiatus in the Iran-Iraq war in our version of 1985. And we have innovated a way to bring in the whole of strategic movement, redeployment, logistics, etc., in a methodology that varies from the use of cards to the use of non-hex, offline, off-map charting, to allow what was a tank and air slugfest to become a strategic stroke operational level game where you as the player end up making the kind of decisions that we were originally paying 4- and 5-star generals to do. So that's me. That's what we did in those terms. As far as what we're doing in C3, which is dropping down a level in terms of operational capability to what used to be called the core level or operational level, I'll let Fabrizio take it back, and we will look at some of the innovations over the various parts that we've been doing over the last year or two. Fabrizio.
Okay, so the C3 series is heavily focused on the command, control, and communication problems, its constraints, and its effects. So it's quite different from most commercial war games because you really have to plan your actions, and your planning is not an immediate effect on the battlefield. And for example, the first probably most important part of the game is the representation of the C3 concept, because every unit needs some order, and that order will bring the unit to deploy on the battlefield in a certain way. So your units will not be able, for example, to attack and to defend at the same time at their best. It will depend by the orders you gave to your units, if they're good in defending against an enemy at assault, or if they're good to attack the enemy. There are also some jack of all trades deployment, that is the so-called tactical deployment, where a unit will be quite decently able to move. We will be able to attack most decent in a decent manner, and will be able to defend too. But if you really want to use them at their maximum level, you have to give specific orders. This order will take time, and the time needed by the headquarters to conceive, to write, and to transmit the orders along the chain of command. And after that, when the orders finally arrives at the maneuver elements, the maneuver elements will need additional time to actually deploy on the battlefield according to the orders received. All these will brings also the workload on the command staff. So your command staff will not be able to do everything at the same time. If it's, for example, writing down the order for a whole division to change its deployment from defense to assault, there will be not too much time and too many human resources to use available for doing or for planning other things. And finally, another aspect that is taken into account is that any problem along the chain of command imposes an additional delay for the orders. So, for example, if one of the quarter along the chain of command has been bombarded by enemy artillery or has incurred in losses, there will be an additional delay. So making the whole process even slower, up to a point that if for example, an important quarter has been completely eliminated by an enemy bombardment or enemy attack, the chain of command will be broken, and we actually not be able to send out and to issue current orders until the chain of command has been actually restored. And I think that's it more or less for the chain of command. And now up to Tony again for the tactical movements.
So how do you innovate in movement? It's pretty, there are simply, historically in war games, in hobby war games, there have been one of two methodologies. It's either people get obsessed by, my tank or this type of tank, an M1 tank can do 47.35 miles an hour when crossing the road or whatever. Or it goes down and says, track vehicles do, move at this rate, and wheeled vehicles move at that rate, and foot soldiers move at that rate, and will knock a bit off if they're going cross country, that sort of thing. We looked at it slightly differently, and as you can see very simply from the graphic that's in front of you there, we essentially decided that we would do what the militaries do, and that we would there are essentially three methods of moving: column mode, which we assume moves at 20 to 30 k's an hour, day or not k's in the hour; tactical mode, which is essentially using the best methodology to move across the ground; and deployed mode, which is exactly as it says. And then for each of the hexes, we then apply what the engineers would do for real, which is that you end up with a go or a no-go terrain, and that then affects there. And so you end up with you being able to look at how far or what kind of posture do you have to put your force in if you wanted to rapidly advance over X type of terrain, and take all the consequential penalties for choosing the wrong one, or the consequential benefits for choosing the right one. So there we go. Very different from just saying, I've got 15 movement points and I'll take off 2 for here and 1 for there. It's a bit more nuanced than that. Fabrizio.
Okay, the next point of innovation in the system is probably the retrograde operations and the disengagement system. In most commercial war games, you have, for example, the retreat result for the defender. And at that point, the defender is forced or has the possibility to retreat. In C3, there is no retreat result. The defender may choose to retreat during any combat, but the problem is that the retreat is not automatic or assured. So the defender has to try to disengage actually from the combat, and disengaging, as probably many of you knows, it's actually a quite risky operation. So it must be prepared beforehand. Your unit must be placed in a terrain that will allow to retreat if needed. will need deployment on the ground that will facilitate retrograde operation or a disengagement. The support from friendly units can also help in retreating from a combat. Recent engagement or bombardment can hamper or disrupt the disengagement and so on. There are several factors that are considered and that must be taken into account for a successful disengagement. In the end, if a disengagement is successful, the defender will be able to reduce any losses incurred in combat. And on the other side, if the disengagement is not successful, the losses could actually increase, or the disengagement could fail at all, and the defender will be forced to stay in place and keep and take additional punishment from the attacker. So the disengagement and the retreat it's quite a complex and a risky matter, as I said, and I think that the C3 series is quite good in representing this, because you cannot simply decide to retreat at the last minute as an afterthought. You really have to plan for your units, to prepare the channels of retreat, to prepare artillery and their support for helping disengagement, to prepare your support from other units that could help the retreating unit or substitute the retreating unit in the front line, and so on. There are a lot of aspects to take into account. And now to Tony again for combat uncertainty.
And as you just heard Fabrizio say, one of the things that we wanted to put back into games was a degree of combat uncertainty. Anybody who has played hobby war games over the years has at some stage in their life played an opponent who sits there and takes forever to do one turn. And the reason he sits there and takes forever is he sat down calculating the exact numbers required to do course of action A, or if I do course of action B, I'll need to throw this, that, and the other, and that is such and such a percentage chance, and so on and so forth, and it goes on. The real world is not like that. Things go wrong. The minutiae of life go wrong. And we wanted to make sure that that was included. And more than just the random throw of one dice saying that. So we have random throws of a number of die. And in essence, you can never, no matter with the best will in the world, you can never guarantee the exact effect of your artillery or your air. Will you get EW? Will it work? Does it function? You can try and improve it, but you can never be certain. And really introducing uncertainty across the board in areas that have always been certain in standard wargaming, such as the results of CRTs, does give certainly we have found with our customers a completely different feel to the game, and one which they appear to be happy with. So that's us, really. That's combat uncertainty. So back to Fab.
Okay. So the next point is the engineer support and river crossing. In most commercial war games, not in everybody, most of them, when a unit has to cross a river, it's quite a simple matter. You just pay an extra movement cost to cross the river, and that's it. End of the problem. Of course, reality is quite different. In the C3 system, we have basically 4 different types of river crossing, and most of them require engineer support, require common staff workload to plan them, to send in the engineers, and to plan the execution of a river crossing. So you have to decide in advance, even for river crossing, you have to decide in advance which kind of river crossing you're going to execute, and you have to plan in advance your resources in order to actually execute it. Basically, the four kind of river crossing that we are represented are hasty crossing that is can be executed by any amphibious unit using only the embedded engineers and the equipment, its own equipment, the equipment on hand with the unit, and is of course quite fast. But of course, if you are going to have an opposed hasty river crossing, is also quite dangerous. The second method is deliberate crossing, where you're actually going to use some engineer support. So the engineers must arrive on place. The quarter must commit the engineers to the crossing, and so on. So it requires more resources. The third kind of crossing is by using ribbon bridges. Ribbon bridges will need again engineer support, and will need common staff workload, time from the common staff to plan them, and will also need time for the engineer to actually assemble the ribbon bridges. Moreover, the ribbon bridge needs practically a constant engineer presence in order to be kept operational. So it's quite fast to assemble, but after that you need to keep your precious engineering resources busy on site, keeping the ribbon bridge working. And the last type of crossing is with the panel bridges. With the panel bridge, again, you need common staff for planning and engineer support. Will take more time than a ribbon bridge to be assembled. But on the positive side, once it has been assembled, it will need only a minimal engineer maintenance. So your engineer resources will be able can be used somewhere else for that. So these are the four types. Moreover, and opposed some types of river crossing, the hasty and the deliberate crossing, both have a risk of accidents. The bottom of a river can be rocky or murky. The amphibious equipment could malfunction. So there are a lot of stuff that actually could go wrong. And so a unit trying a hasty or deliberate river crossing incurs the possibility of attrition just for trying it, because of some of its equipment will go basically to the bottom of the river. And that's it. And now up to Tony again. No, it's up to me again for the SIGINT and the detection of enemy position. This is another very interesting, in my opinion, feature of the C3 series. the signal intelligence and the detection of enemy position. Basically, the effectiveness of the effectiveness of artillery, missile, and airstrikes depends by how precisely the enemy position can be pinpointed on a map, on the coordinates. And the system takes into account a series of factors to decide how good the position of the enemy has been pinpointed. These factors are basically the distance from friendly units, the ground reconnaissance, air reconnaissance, and last but not least, the signal intelligence. That is, for example, when that is acquired when an enemy headquarters, for example, start issuing orders. So its radio traffic is going to increase. This, of course, is if the headquarters has not had not the time to prepare cable connection, and so avoiding to avoid the increase in radio traffic. But an headquarters that is moving is bound to use its radio equipment to transmit orders, to communicate with its units, and so it will emit an enormous quantity of signal intelligence that can be used by the enemy to detect its exact position. So artillery and airstrikes heavily depends by the detection level of the enemy that they are going to hit, and that's a very, very important part of the game. And now, Tony.
So, finally, to finish this off, you will rarely find in war games or in hobby war games that purport to talk about NATO and the Warsaw Pact national characteristics, other than occasionally somebody will make a call that these people were perhaps slightly more professional than the others, or these people were slightly different from the others. And there is something like a CARDA rating, a +1 on a dice if you belong to a professional army like the Canadians or the Brits or somebody, and perhaps an even throw if you're deemed to be the best of the conscript armies at the time, for example, the Bundeswehr in the 1980s, or some such like that. The thing that struck me when I came in is that, and having worked in NATO a lot for real over the time period and afterwards, actually first time I went to NATO is in the late 1980s, and the last time I worked in there was in the mid 2000s, is that it is not a homogeneous element. If there are differences, there is no such thing as NATO doctrine. There are some overarching principles, but they're interpreted differently by the United States, by the United Kingdom, by the Germans, by the Dutch, by the bomb. And so that you will see in our games in the C3 series that as you play the NATO, you have to play each of the nationalities within the game slightly differently to play to their strengths or their weaknesses. If you're attacking them, and you'll see some of them listed up there. It allows differing nations are allowed differing increases. So the reality of West Germany is that they can react faster. Their order system is their OODA loop, if you like, is pretty quick because of outside tactic. The Warsaw Pact has the ability to assault from the line of march, but it does so at various costs that you have to understand both as a Warsaw Pact player, but also as a NATO player, and so on and so forth for the others. And that list will get longer as we go through the rest of the games and develop them, and they bring them out and publish them, and whether we start to include, Danes and Dutchmen and Frenchmen and so on and so forth. So that's really where we went with national characteristics. And if we just then quickly round up the whole thing and put a conclusion on this, we've listed a lot of things that make this sound incredibly complicated, much more like a simulation than a game. But the real innovation, I think, is here, is that it is a game. It is playable as a game. It is playable as a game with one person playing. You do not need a whole staff to support you. You can play it relatively rapidly once you know and understand the rules and understand the concepts. It's got a long learning curve, but it's a hobby war game, and so for playability is the key to this, and that is what we have endeavored to bring in with this system and with the 1985 system. And I think that's probably us as far as introductions are concerned. So let's hand back to Mo.
All righty. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate you guys. It was a great presentation. And we already have some questions in the Discord that we will be talking about when we hit the Q&A segment after Bruce is done. Bruce, do you have any slides or screens you'd like to share?
I do. So let me share my my first file here.
Okay.
Right. And I think it's going to be easiest if I just share my desktop.
Sure.
So let's go with that. And all right. Can you see my screen?
I do not see anything yet. Oh, there we go. All righty.
Does that
So
work?
you should be all set. All right. I'll hand it over to you, Bruce.
So, Mo, my understanding is that this audience is largely an audience out of the professional military arms, and that your interest in wargaming, and particularly in attending this convention, is how you might bring some ideas coming out of the civilian economy, professional military simulations that are designed to educate and practice professional officers in their trade. And so I'm going to focus on a couple of things that I believe are innovations that solve problems that military wargame designers face, because in many regards you face many of the same problems that we face. So I'm going to cherry pick just a couple of things from my designs that I think might be helpful. So let's begin with the classic problem of something called a zone of control. The zone of control came out of early, and the basic concept was that a unit occupied not only the central hex in which it was located, but either occupied or projected firepower into the 6 adjacent hexes. That was one of the most fundamental innovations in the early days of wargaming. It has, however, over the years created lots of problems. Zones of control can be rigid, which means that you cannot move through them. They can be locking, which means once you enter them, you cannot exit them except through combat. Or they can be porous, meaning that you can, in fact, move through them, usually at a much reduced rate. With rigid ZOCs, where you cannot move from one ZOC to another, the defending player has a huge incentive to set up a defense line exactly as I have shown here. The enemy cannot go through these open areas between my super stacks, and I have stacked all of my units 2 to 3 hexes apart in the very best terrain, and you are going to have to dig me out of that very best terrain, attacking all of my forces in that area in order to penetrate my line. The fact that this hex here, which in this particular game, which is NATO, each hex is 15 miles. The fact that this 15 miles is only covered by artillery is irrelevant. My ZOCs are locking, and you cannot break through this 15-mile gap in my line. You're going to have to dig me out of this city of Oldenburg or dig me out of this forest here. This is perfectly good deployment for a wargamer, but it is a terrible deployment from the perspective of teaching anybody anything about how to hold a line in the real world, because if you gave the Soviets a 15-mile gap in your lines, you can bet that before you'd finish frying your breakfast bacon, miles in your rear. So when I set out to design this game, I wanted to solve this problem because it really bothered me. So the requirement was that I was going to force players to defend every single hex in the line, because it was absurd to think that NATO would have left 15 to 30 mile gaps in their line covered only by artillery and attack helicopters. So the rule system required ZOCs to be extremely porous so that I could penalize a player who left a 15-mile gap in his line, and therefore the NATO player is now required to defend his whole line, not by a rule, but by the fear that the enemy is going to penetrate the line. That puts the NATO player in the position of defending like this, where he is holding every hex so that the enemy doesn't get a free breakthrough. But this creates an entirely different problem, which is now the enemy during his turn is going to be able to concentrate all of his forces on one hex and achieve overwhelming odds, whilst the rest of my units essentially do nothing during that particular turn. So I needed to solve the problem that people do hold continuous lines, but they need to be able to reinforce a line where it is threatened. And so what I introduced was, which is a dynamic defender function during the attacker's turn. And so the concept is that a unit that is not my apologies, I'm recovering from a cold. A unit that is not the last unit in the hex has the ability to react into an adjacent hex just before a combat is executed, so that the line will bunch up where an attack is delivered, and I am not penalized for covering my whole line. So this unit here in cannot react because it would be the last unit in the hex. But this Dutch unit up here with the 2 arrows could react either north or south because it is not the only unit in that hex. Same for this West German Panzer unit, and same for either of these 2 armor brigades, which could react to reinforce an adjacent hex if it is threatened. Now, that is a viable deployment in this game system for NATO, but by putting my reserves up on the front line, I have also stacked them, meaning that enemy airstrikes into that hex are going to catch both of those units. So in the rules, players who play the game after a while and suffer from the lash of enemy air power learn to play it like this, where they actually hold reserves. Those reserves then react in to the frontline hexes, meaning that an enemy airstrike now has to choose between hitting a frontline unit or hitting the reserve, but cannot hit both. And so this system, with a very simple rule, encourages the 2 opponents to begin to develop a front line and a set of reserves that actually starts to look the way real world commanders would deploy. And so, example of a designer facing a problem set and coming up with a game system that encourages players to build a defensive line or to construct an attack, whatever the problem set is, in a way that is realistic with a few simple rules. All right, I'm going to move on from the topic of reaction. Another thing in NATO that I rather liked was this. So here is a conventional battle. We have 3 hexes adjacent to this battle marker, and they are going to attack. There will be a determination of what the attack odds are, a die roll in the CRT, and the result. And that's a conventional attack. But one of the things that we all know is that the objective of any commander is to outflank his opponent, and if possible, pocket him and pound him. So I wanted to build a game system that rewarded players for achieving that outcome. And so I created a concept called a flanking attack. If a unit is surrounded by enemy zones of control, but is still adjacent to a friendly unit, he is flanked. So here, the Soviets have been able to get far enough into NATO's rear that they are now flanking this battlefield, and they are going to get a column shift in their favor. And then finally, have actually surrounded that enemy unit and it is not adjacent to another friendly unit, then they get something termed a concentric attack, and that gives them 2 column shifts. But this deeply rewards a player who stages his attack in a way that allows one attack to punch a hole in the enemy's line and outflank the target of the next attack. And also it encourages things like vertical envelopment by airborne troops to cut off somebody's line of retreat and actually have that reflected in the combat odds of the attack. So this is just an example of, a small example, of trying to reward a player for behavior that we want them to mimic. All right, so I will move off of NATO, and I'm now going to move to my second design, which is air and armor. Okay, so air and armor, like NATO, is set in West Germany in the mid-1980s. However, unlike NATO, where each hex is 15 miles, in air and armor, each hex is 1 mile, and therefore it is a much more tactical game.
Hey, Bruce, I just want to jump in for 1 second. We're not seeing the slides advance.
Oops. You mean none of the slides that I just showed advance?
The last we saw was the battle with the flanking attack.
Okay. So you're not currently seeing my screen, right?
I do see a screen. Here we go.
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to reshare. Mm-hmm. Let's see if I can get this to go where I need to be.
Gremlin's always got to get in the way, right?
But of course. All right. All right, so that's not the right screen. Ah, your browser has blocked your screen. That's very strange. Okay.
Oh, he dropped out for a second, so we'll just have to wait for Bruce to reconnect. He must have had some issues with his internet. He does have some internet issues, I know that. But while we're waiting for him to join us back, if you have any questions, make sure that you are saving them, or you can actually post them in here as well, and we will get to them at the end when we get to the Q&A segment. and we'll give Bruce a couple minutes here to see if he can get back. If not, we will proceed on to the Q&A and at least get started on that. But he is back, so that's good, because otherwise I was going to say we'll start with Q&A, and then when Bruce gets his internet sorted, we'll get him back on and let him finish his presentation.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that happens.
Let's see if I can find the right interface here. All right, I'm going to share my entire screen, and I'm going to hope that this works this time. All right,
there we go.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, there we go.
I will go ahead and remove myself, and it's all back to you.
Thank you for letting me know. So, as I was saying, Air and Armor is set in the 1980s as well, but at the tactical level, so that each hex is 1 mile across, no, 50 miles across. So every war game is a simulation, and it is an abstraction. And so the designer has got to determine what he is going to focus on. So, for example, in Tony and Fabrizio's game, they have focused very much on C3I. And so the game is set around the challenges that a commander faces in planning his operations, and essentially outwitting his opponent by thinking at the right place at the right time in the right posture, several turns down the road, therefore wrong-footing his opponent. And that becomes the focus of the simulation. The problem set that I set out to solve is that most war games give players an absolutely godlike view of the battlefield. They can see exactly where their opponent's units are and generally have a pretty good idea of what they are capable of. I wanted to defeat this because I would put it to you that the job of a commanding officer is to manage chaos. War is nothing if not chaotic, and teaching people how to perfect their operations in a command intelligence and perfect control gives them a very, very artificial sense of their ability to command events on a real battlefield. In a real battlefield, everything is chaos, and you're trying to manage that chaos. If we are going to train officers, they have to be trained as close as possible to the stress of real battle. And you eliminate a great deal of that stress when you can show him exactly where his opponents are. So, at least in the civilian wargaming world, that absence of any kind of a double blind, that inability to create the fog of war, is a challenge for producing. So in Air and Armor, that was what I chose to focus on, was the fog of war. And I did it in 2 layers, and I'm going to demonstrate this now. So layer 1 is something called open mode, in which I know where my own units are, but I do not know where the enemy's units are. Now, as you can see here, yes, I know where the enemy's units are. I am the Soviet player. I am staring at an array of US units that are deployed. I know exactly where those units are. What do you mean, fog of war? Well, the game system plays what the Russians love to call maskirovka with you. So, yes, I do know. Unfortunately, I don't know what they are. So every unit counter here is paired with a step. So a classic step is a reinforced company. And so NATO can stack up to a battalion in a hex. So this Bradley unit here might be a dummy. It could contain 1 company, or it could contain an entire battalion. I don't know, as the Soviet player, what marker is underneath that. Now, there is a marker, but only the NATO player knows what it is. I don't. And the only way I'm going to find out what's underneath that unit is either to move into contact with it or to use my reconnaissance assets to attempt to see it. But if that unit was a dummy, I'm launching an attack on that position and there isn't anybody there. Meaning, yes, I can see exactly where my opponent's units are, but I have absolutely no idea where his real force is deployed. So I do, in this setup, however, have the ability to control my own forces. So in this game, a Soviet regiment has 3 unit counters, and it's got and so when I enter this unit, I can determine what it looks like. So I may say, okay, I'm going to put 1 company in the first unit. I'm going to make the second unit a dummy. And I'm going to put virtually all of the regiment in the third unit. And so I might launch my attack down this road by moving my 1 unit adjacent to the enemy so that I can determine what he is. I might move my dummy out here, threatening to outflank that position, but I've moved here because my plan is actually to go hit him through the forest. And I'm hoping to mislead my opponent into thinking that my main force is over here, when in fact it's not. So this creates an incredible sense of hidden, essentially the fog of war, and this hidden unit system means that I have to take a lot of risks and operate in an environment of uncertainty, and it also gives me the ability to create feints, deceptions, traps, and ambushes, which are virtually impossible to do in a war game where you have a godlike sense of control. All right, so, which is called open mode. However, there is a second layer of this game, which is called hidden mode. And in hidden mode, not only do I not know where the enemy's forces are located, but I'm not entirely sure of where my own forces are located. Now, you might say, well, wait a second, but I mean, I do know where my own forces are located. Well, not really. As anybody who has commanded real-world operations knows, units report that they are in places that they are not. Units fail to report. Units get lost. Units get jammed. Knowing where your own forces are at any one particular point in time is almost as challenging as knowing where they are. And just to highlight that problem, I want to just regale you with the fact that the first known use of the term fog of war appeared in a book called, unsurprisingly, The Fog of War, which was written by a British colonel in 1896. His name was Sir Lonsdale Augustus Hale. And here was the primary quote that everybody has used since that book. He described the fog of war as, quote, the state of ignorance in which commanders frequently find themselves as regards the real strength and position, not only of their foes, friends. And so in hidden mode, I don't know where my own units are. So let's do this again for a second. So I'm now going to consider an attack on this position here. I'm going to enter my units, but they don't have step markers. In hidden mode, I'm not the one who makes that determination. So we will remove these markers and we will simply say that my regiment enters and it's got the 3 counters that I start with. So these 3 counters are now going to be coming in off mat. And so I move my first counter here. And I am now going to roll on a table which correlates the type of unit that is moving with the type of operation that they are performing. And so there would be a die roll on that table, and I might determine that this particular unit has now showed up with 2 companies. And then I might move my second unit in here, and it might turn out to be a dummy, which means that it is instantly removed, and so that unit wasn't real. And then I may say, okay, I'll move my third unit in here, and I may roll fairly well, and so I've got 4 companies in here. Well, this was a full-strength regiment. It had 9 reinforced companies. 6 of them have actually made it into this battle. The other 3 companies are lost. They are somewhere else. And so this attack would then be resolved. If we didn't know what the defender was, the defender would also make a roll to see what he had here. And so both sides are doing their best to get their forces where they need them. But there is no guarantee that all those forces are going to be in the right place at the right time. It is chaotic. Players report that it is quite stressful to play the game in hidden mode because you really aren't in control. But as a simulation of the true command environment and as a test of an office, this is a far more realistic simulation than your typical, at least commercial war game, in which a player has a godlike control over his forces and his intelligence on his enemy forces. So I'll stop there, but that is one innovation that I think put players in a much more realistic battlefield situation than a conventional war game. Mo, back to you.
I'm going to be bringing everyone back into the stream, being that all the presentations are done. So thank you all for the presentations today. Number one, y'all did a great job. I really appreciate that. And I know people in the audience do as well. So what we're going to do is now we're going to transition to the Q&A segment. So if you have any questions, make sure you post them in the YouTube chat and we will put them up on screen for everyone to discuss. And we will also be, talking about things amongst ourselves. One of the things I wanted to hit on first was, Mitch, in your presentation, you talked about app-assisted games and the innovations there I think are great. However, you did bring up one of my pet peeves with those, which is they have to have support or be open source code at the end of the developer's life cycle. So that way they can continue on, because I can pull out a game from 1958, an original copy of Tactics, and play it today the same way you could play back then. However, any of the games that are app assisted in 50 years, you may not be able to play that unless it's open source code and get support from the community.
Yeah. Well, and in 50 years, you're probably still not going to be able to play it. But,
yeah,
that's one of the interesting conundrums, I think. So if it's open source, though, you could probably reverse engineer it and do something else with it. But I think from an immediate standpoint, yes, it's very neat. And yes, it can be very helpful. But you need to consider the long-term ramifications and what that might mean from a publishing standpoint of how long do I want to support this, and do I end up, you know what, we're done. Here's the source. If somebody wants to go create a bunch of tables or something, charts that you can roll on to recreate what actually the app was doing, here you go. Here's how it works. Right?
Very true. And we do have one question that came in earlier from Timothy Smith saying, I've heard scuttlebutt that the 5 games in the series are being considered for reprint. They all sold out amazingly quickly. And I believe he was talking about the C3 games as well as the 1985 games. So if you guys have any comments about that, Fabrizio and Tony.
Fabrizio? Considered for a print. The 5 games, all of them. I mean, they sold out amazingly quickly, and that's also because we really have usually very small print runs, under 1,000. The real problem for reprinting is that we are a really, really small publishing company. Basically, the whole publishing company is present right now at this conference, and I mean everybody. The people making the boxes and making the deliveries. It's here too. So a reprint, it's something that takes a considerable chunk of our already limited resources. And as I've written on our site, having fun is also very important for us, and reprinting is actually usually not much fun. So we try not to avoid them, but we are doing them with slower than most of the other publishers. When by popular demand or by threats, they convince us to actually make a reprint. The next publishing actually will be a reprint. It's the reprint of 1985 Deadly Northern Lights.
Mm-hmm.
It is the second module of a 1985 series that covers the war in the Northern Europe.
Okay.
And after that, it could be that we have more reprints with less than 60 miles, but we'll see.
Excellent.
Sorry for that.
No. That was great information. We have a question from Pratima Weera, and I apologize if I butcher anyone's names. That is not intentional. Great presentation. My question, have there been innovations that aren't directly related to battle realism? For example, innovations on playability, like how to make it, that's a great thing that I know you all have to deal with as far as separating the realism and simulation from gaming, and, make it where it's more game than it is a hardcore simulation. So Bruce, why don't you handle that one first? Bruce, you hear me?
Hey, sorry about that. Had to unmute.
I was like, he's just like, how the hell are you, Mo?
You know how not. But yeah, playability. So one thing that I've seen a great deal of attention being paid to by publishers is this concept of player aids. And so, in the old days, you would have a map, you would have counters, you would have rules, and a charts and tables booklet, and you would really be left on your own to put all the pieces together. Now, increasingly, publishers are willing to pay for ancillary player aids, cards. And when I say cards, I mean 8 by 11 cardstock, cheat sheets. And as designers, when we throw our designs over to our playtesters, very often the playtesters will develop cheat sheets, right? They will develop little summaries to remind them how a given mechanic works, or little graphics. And I have learned to just comb through their posts and their comments, looking for what the playtesters actually came up with to condense and summarize the rules in a way that makes it easy for them to play without constantly referring back to the rules. And so I think that that is at least one innovation that has made games, even fairly complex games. A second one is leaving aside this idea that a game is just what is in the box. That's really important, because today a modern game is not just a set of components in a box, but it is also a whole web presence of files and comments, questions and answers that are posted in things like Board Game Geek and Consim World. And then it is also a lot of video tutorials. Mo has been particularly adept at helping designers in this industry come up with a whole series of videos around their games that give context, examples of play, and then tutorials on actually how you as a player would get into the game. And so I think one of the great innovations is not thinking about the game as just the box, but in fact an entire penumbra of artifacts that are out there in the web space that help support a game. Fab, Tony, you want to add anything to that?
Well, as Fabrizio seems to be answering the phone, I'll dive in first. I would agree with everything that Bruce has just said, and to which I think the other one that I would add is that without a shadow of a doubt, we at TRL produce big games and complex. I'm not going to say complicated, they're complex. But therefore, there is quite a lot of work that goes into building a step series of scenarios that allows you to learn how the game functions, both in terms of the basic rule sets, but actually then adding in the layers of complexity one on top of another until you go from having just your, a very simple, I'll use the words again, tank and plane slugfest in a 10 by 10k area to dominating the world or whatever it is that takes your bag when you're playing a commercial war game. But that whole business of stepped, linked scenarios that teach you the game and teach you the complexities without being, but by making it more playable is, I think, quite modern and quite key, and we wouldn't do anything without those these days, I don't think. Fab?
Yeah. I basically agree, because we produce basically monster games, and as Tony said, they are usually complex games. So playability by itself has never been a first target for us. We have scenarios stepping up the complexity, and introducing the player into the game up to the whole campaign with all his assets and his features. But playability is usually not our first concern. I'm not saying that our games are not playable, of course, but we are not striving for playability at all costs. I think that it's actually a market tendency, probably the most important market tendency in the recent years, because a lot of publishers are trying to, and I think that's correct, try to attract more and more players by making most of their publication simpler. Probably all the people present today here at this conference is of the opposite school, because our games are not the simplest on the market right now. Mitch games, Bruce games, and TRL games, it's difficult to catalog them as a simple game or very playable games. We strive for reality and strive for probably for complexity. That's it.
Well, Mitch, before you get your portion in, these guys are talking about step learning approach, and you have something already similar in the Next War series, in that you have the scenarios that are the basic game, because you have two sets of rules.
Standard,
not basic, or the standard. Sorry, basic. Sorry, got it wrong. The standard game, and then the advanced game, which definitely ramps things up.
Right.
But in the standard game, you have several scenarios to get everybody's feet wet, and then you can go on up to the advanced game. So,
yeah, I mean, I think Fab hits the nail on the head. The games, and I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, right, is the games that the three of us or four of us are putting out are not that game, right? From a innovation stand, not that we're not being innovative, but from a monster game or large complex game, that's what we're building. It's an interesting question, because, and I think Fab, you hit on it, is that what we're seeing over the last couple of years through the growth of the Euro gaming market is a lot of those concepts are bleeding over, I think, into war games, where you're seeing designers abstracting out things. So they'll turn it over to a playtester, like Bruce was saying, and playtesters are having trouble with whatever concept, pick concept A. And so the challenge now on the designer is, how do I abstract that, right? How do I make that a little bit easier? Is it a card draw mechanism? Do we just throw the rule out? Do we turn that into a block instead of a counter? Or, whatever the case may be, is how do you make that easier? In the Next War series specifically, the clearing operations mechanism came from the original Crisis Korea game, had a totally different advanced to control concept, which it was all table driven. You had to count up steps. You had to do all this work, look at a table and roll a die, and it either worked or didn't. Well, so from an abstraction standpoint, put a marker down, roll against that number, and here's some modifiers, right? So it makes it much faster, almost a game within a game. So those kinds of playability things, I would say yes. I think some of the larger things that we're seeing are things like, I talked about it earlier, Atlantic Chase, which is, from a playability standpoint, you don't put a lot of pieces down, and the rules are, I don't want to say simple, very straightforward about how you manage things, right? But at the end of the day, you have a pretty interactive, not complicated game, but interesting game to play, right? But you don't have the traditional hex counter. I'm moving. I've got Zocs. I've got this. I've got that. So I think, yes, to answer the question, I think those are some examples in innovation.
Well, being that we've got you, I'm going to go right back to you with this question. And you and I have already talked about this, so this would be great for the audience here. Timothy's saying, can't remember the term for the human behavioral proficiency, talking about efficiency rating.
Efficiency, yeah.
But has the Russian conduct on Ukraine suggested mods needed in Next War Poland?
So go watch Whiskey Charlie from April 1st. Because we did cover it. So, and I'll say the same thing I did there, really, from my perspective, two things. One is it's a little too early. I think there were a lot of factors in play at the beginning that mitigate what we saw. That's just my opinion right now. I think given the what do you want to call it? Restaging of the conflict, I think we might see something different. Whether it's better or not from the Russian point of view, I don't know. But I think it will be telling if we do, right? In terms of the next war system, like I just said on Whiskey Charlie, what you're seeing is or what we saw at the beginning was an extended buildup scenario, and the new person to Wargaming was playing the Russians, right? So,
yeah, very true. And then we've got one from Discord, and this is going to be multi-part, so I'm going to show that in sections here. He's wondering how he'd be interested in how different armies behave regarding command and control. This is for the C3 series. Mm-hmm. For example, in mission tactics, trained force relies on junior commanders to make decisions on the fly and simply following the commander's intent. A more rigid top-down style of command that might be seen in a Soviet-trained force would have less flexibility once they're encountered friction on the battlefield. Are these differences modeled in the C3 series games?
Yeah, they are modeled more or less exactly as Tommy said. For example, because the so-called mission tactics, that is the German Aufgabe tactics, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, are modeled in the C3 series. In fact, the West German units have the possibility to change their deployment on the battlefield faster than the units of the other nations. And that's thanks to the Aufgabe tactics. That's something that is in the soul of the German army since the Prussian times. And it's something that you cannot simply export to another army just by publishing, for example, a field manual describing the Aufgabe tactics. It's something that it's a mental behavior. It's a mental state for that is needed to really apply it. And on the opposite side, there are the Soviets. I don't know if Tony want to spend a couple of words in defense of Soviets.
Do I want to defend the Soviets? Well,
not at all. Not at all.
I mean, I would say the following. Are the differences modeled? Very much so. The first thing I would say, and it's a bit of a history lesson, but in 1985, the only people using mission command were the Germans. The US had just decided that it might want to teach it. The UK had decided that it might want to teach it. And perhaps the first couple of lieutenants or second lieutenants were falling out of the academies who learnt it. And the odd staff officer who's falling out of, the staff college might have learned it. Bloody sure the generals hadn't done anything about it. In fact, I had one who, when given, said one piece of paper and a diagram and was told that was the divisional op order, said, where's the op order? Because what he was expecting was a stack of paper this thick that had to be delivered out. Now, the general was re-educated by his own staff over the course of his command tour. These things happen, but they weren't there. In gaming terms, what it does is allow the Germans get to react faster. Their OODA loop is quicker. They have that whole thing. They are able to change orders and states that they're in more quickly. For the others, there are some differences. NATO, the rest of NATO, if you like, then becomes the standard, top-down, but supported by a massive communication system that, as long as it's not being jammed, is very efficient and works and makes dissemination of orders easier. What, in defense of the Soviets, what the Soviets, however, have is a massive planning process at the beginning that produces an incredibly detailed plan, but actually it breaks that incredibly detailed plan down into bite-sized chunks the further and further and further you are down the system. And having got your bite-sized chunk, it doesn't matter whether you can talk to the senior officer above it. You know what you have to do. So do what you have to do and keep on doing it until you can't do it anymore because of casualties or whatever. So yes, that's exactly the point. We do try and represent, and we do try and understand each nation's command and control system as it existed for real in about 1985.
I'll just add that in the C3 system, the Soviets have probably more inertia as a common in their common system. They are able to give orders quite fast to big units, but once that those formations start moving, their inertia is enormous, and stopping or changing them, it's quite complicated.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Fab, but in the C3 series, some of that's modeled in terms of the modes that certain sides can adopt. So, for instance, NATO can do active defense, but the Soviets can't do active defense, right? And I think only NATO could do screening or screening, and those kinds of things. So there are certain ways that the units can act that is only applicable to one side or the other, which then has game effects, right?
Correct. And so the Soviets can do
like close
much
support,
better
right?
attacks off the line of march, or if they're in route marching, they can actually do some reasonable attacks on that. If it goes wrong, they're in stuck, but if it goes right, they keep on going. Yeah, it's very much done. It's very much done that way around.
Okay, so we have another one from Jeff Beeler. He's saying, how useful would it be to apply your innovations to war games on earlier periods of history? Do those periods provide relevant experiences to modern warfare? Mitch?
That's a tough question. I mean, at a basic level, sure, because hex counter combat, yes, that could be applied. I think where some of the innovations come in is, so for instance, in the next war series, it's the sequence of play and how things interact and how you get the multi-domain warfare to be shown, right? Although it's a little odd because you're breaking it up into chunks as opposed to it's a continuous stream of things, right? I think what you might see is some changes the further you go back. I mean, obviously going back to trying to take something like Next War back to Rome versus Carthage might not work so well because it's just not how warfare was conducted, right? Different concerns, different methods, and different ways of conducting that battle, strategically and tactically. Obviously, at the end of the day, yeah, it's boots on the ground, but but you can only take an abstraction so far, I think.
True. Tony or Fab?
I would say you need a different set of innovations. I mean, I'd absolutely agree with Mitch that we've been trying to represent, shall we say, late 20th century, 21st century warfare. It's probably the most complex it's ever been in terms of the number of different elements that have to be bound in and all come together at the same time to make a plan work. And actually, it's because the original hobby games were all about World War II, if we really want to be accurate about it, in terms, clank, clank, I'm a tank, and an aeroplane flies over, and there's a grunt digging a hole in the ground, and that's pretty much about it, and some guns and stuff. But that's pretty much about it. It's everything else that's been added since 1945 that's made it more and more and more and more complex, and therefore there's had to be more and more and more innovation in order to try and keep the game playable in its, and by that I mean it in its broadest definition, i.e. that a single person can sit down at a table across the other side of the table or across the other side of the vassal interface or whatever it is you're playing on is one other person, and you can have a game. And it isn't going to take you the rest of your life to play it. It's got some purpose and it will get to an end eventually. I think in the nicest possible way, the further you go back, the actual bit on the battlefield becomes easier and easier. If you get straight all the way back to some sort of Dark Age slugfest where you just line up two sides and go bang and then start hacking with swords, there are all sorts of things, unless you want to go down to the level of the individual human interaction and trying to sort of model, morale in a different way, or raison d'etre for fighting, or fighting spirit and fighting will and all of that stuff. But actually the rest is pretty easy. What becomes more complex if you go back, where I think there are some innovative techniques that have been developed for the more complex modern games, where if you were to take if you were to have a game like, I was going to say Rome Total War, which is of course a computer game, but that sort of thing, if you've got a campaign game set in ancient or medieval times, the actual physical difficulties of getting the logistics right, if you were going to model that, will require some fairly innovative thinking, I think. Otherwise, it's just going to be really, really dull, moving a wagon train across Europe at, 20 miles a day. No, not even that. 15 miles a day is a really dull process. You need a better thing to do than that. But the tactics bit, the actual fighting end, I think that's relatively easy the further back you go. And the innovation isn't required as much as it is in modern day games.
Yeah, that's honestly, that's why I touched on Volko's Levian campaign series. That's what he's done. He's raised it up the level. He's not so worried about the actual battle. You do fight, there is combat, but it's not about the tactical engagement, right? It's about the operational pieces and a little bit slightly larger of the strategic of making sure you're going to have the troops you need to do what you want to do.
I mean, you could in the GMT series, you could argue that your people, again, Volko took the coin thing, which was developed for Chile and the Andes, and has then expanded back, and including expanding it all the way back to do Pendragon, which is, so it's a great game, and has almost zero tactics or anything to do with Dark Ages fighting, but has lots to do with empire building in post-Roman, sub-Roman, or whatever you want to call it these days, Britain.
I'll just add that I agree, mostly agree with you, but I'll just add for the second part of the question that actually I think that the real core of warfare has changed not too much since the times of the Romans. The real core, the real problems, the core problems are all the same. So are always has always been the same. Logistic, morale of troops, movement, and so on. And so, yes, I think that all the past history of warfare is actually a relevant experience, relevant to modern warfare. And I think these core rules of the war will actually never change. And sometimes I also think that actually in past war, some past wars are much less different than we usually think than modern warfare. For example, the first thing that comes to my mind that Napoleon Grand Armée was actually faster getting to Moscow in 1912. In 1812, then the Germans during World War II, and they went there by foot. Yeah, mostly the German too, but they had mechanized forces. But despite mechanized forces and everything else, Napoleon was actually probably a little bit faster than the German to take Moscow, and that's quite surprising if you think about that. That's it.
Well, we got one from Brent from Armchair Dragoon saying, Bruce covered some elements of friendly fog of war, but how can designers incorporate relative levels of unknown competence in friendly forces into a game? For example, how do you ID your own boneheads? So, yeah, that's a good question.
You've seen me play, have you?
Yeah, there have been several attempts on that in time. The first example, but probably the most famous example, it's Full the Gap from SPI, where the units had an untried status, and at the first combat, you just flip the unit and you reveal its true combat powers that could vary by a large amount, actually. So in some way, you ID your boneheads when it was too late. And that's actually a big problem, yeah, for a printed game, basically, because unless you prepare the 3 or 4 different sets of units and to draw randomly every time, you're more or less stuck with a single value. There are, of course, several methods to make this problem less important, but anyway, I think that it's quite not fixable.
That was the conceit of the Victory in the West system, right? In Killing Ground and Overlord, where units, larger units are rated A, B, I think A, B, and C.
Yeah.
And then you would pull a chit, and if you're an A, then you're a 12, or maybe you're an 18, or maybe you're a 9. 9's the bonehead, right?
I hate polar chits.
Sure, but it's a way to solve it.
But there is another way to solve it, which of course is that it's all in the end analysis. It's about squad averages, and whatever die you roll on whatever CRT gives you, the guy's having a bad day, the guy's having a good day. And if you think you've got a lot of boneheads in a particular army, then the squad average level for its competence is a little lower than the squad average level of something else. It's certainly the other way it's been done historically, almost always. I mean, that's your classic Carter rating. Add 7 if you're a member of 3 Commando Brigade. Add 1 if you're an alleged, incompetent such and such a conscript from such and such a country, without wanting to make a calumny on anybody.
And then let the randomization factor play into the CRT of you could be the best force on the planet and still roll a 1.
Absolutely.
True.
Because somebody forgets the crypto.
Then you also have to take into account fatigue too.
If you look at 1st Airborne Division dropping into Arnhem, why can't they get any guns? Somebody forgot the crystals were the wrong crystals for the radio. You know, it's as simple as that. The guy picked up bag A instead of bag B. Bust.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Then one thing I was adding in too is you also have to, or you can, you don't always have to, but you can also model in fatigue because, you know, after sustained combat operations, units are going to get exhausted, material is going to get wore out, and not to mention supply. So that's another thing that could also change the variability of the effectiveness of the units after each battle.
Yep. In C3 series in particular, there is a heavy effect for fatigue, attrition, losses, desertion, and everything else. Yeah.
True. Well, if there are any other questions, please post them in the chat. I don't see any others. So if we don't see one here in the next, say 60 seconds or so, we're going to wrap this up because I think we've got everybody's presentations were great. And I think we've got to answer a lot of questions. But again, I really appreciate all you taking the time today to do this. Appreciate the audience's participation as well. Some great questions in there. And I hope that you found this helpful and useful. And I've posted in the Discord already the locations for each of the game series that we talked about here today. So that way, if you're not familiar with them, you can easily go out there and check out each one of them and get a little bit more information, maybe pick up a copy of them when they're available. Because I know like Fabrizio and Tony, you guys are going through reprints. I know Next War Series is also going through the same thing, and as is NATO. And Air Armor is coming out maybe the end of the year, beginning of next year, sometime around that time frame. So I believe that's it. We don't have any other questions. We do have some thank yous from some people, so we'll get those in here real quick. Thank you, Treb. Appreciate it. Saying to you, Timothy, great questions. Tommy, appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Yep. And I think I think we're all on the Discord. I don't know, Fab. I think I saw you. I don't know, Tony, if you made that there. But if there's questions, you can post them in that channel. Yeah, post them in that channel. We'll have a conversation. We'll have however you want to do it. So.
Absolutely, we do have that here. The dialogue can continue. Use our related Discord channels for after broadcast interaction, and then Chris jumps in and scares everybody.
Right. Yeah. So as long as you're thanking everybody, I'd like to thank all of you guys for such a great panel. I've been sitting here listening to it the entire time, and it was a fantastic panel. So thank you very much for coming and helping make Connections Online a success this year. You guys did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Outstanding. Well, everybody, appreciate it again, and we will catch you on the next in the Discord channel. And make sure that you stick around. There are plenty of more great panels coming around, and enjoy the rest of your Connections experience. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.